Hi everyone, and welcome to this latest in our series of Unlocked in Conversation events. I mean, it is obviously the case that our guest this evening needs very little in the way of introduction, though let me say welcome to Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator. You're getting used to that title now.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, yes.
We're getting an awful, is it me or is it some awful echo? All right, let's see if let's see what happens. Let's hope it goes away. I'm sorry about that. So, Michael is, of course, a former Conservative MP for Surrey Heath from 2005 to 2024. I'm not going to list all your cabinet positions because we've only got an hour and a quarter and it would take too long. You were a co-convener of the official Leave campaign, a journalist before going into politics, and now, as I said, you've gone back into journalism. We'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. To start off with, let's start with what everyone's talking about at the moment, which is the US election.
Yes.
You'd said that if you'd been an American citizen, you'd have voted for Kamala Harris. Why?
Well, I now think actually that that would have been a mistake. I am one of those people who has been, and I think I'm going to instantly alienate at least 90% of the audience now. I'm one of those people who has been impressed by some of the early decisions that Donald Trump has made. But the reason why I said that was, for me, the biggest black mark against Trump was the response that he had to his election defeat in 2020 and the events of January the 6th. So I hope that I would take, from a Conservative point of view, an in-the-round assessment of Trump as 45th president. I think that in foreign policy terms, he was responsible for some things which were genuine achievements, most notably the Abraham Accords. But I also think that if one takes any sort of personal judgment about things which are, for want of a better word, extracurricular out of the equation, and for some people that's impossible, I think that one of the most important things in democracy is losers' consent, and the principle that if you've lost, and you've got to keep the democratic institutions robust. And I felt that the way in which, for example, Mike Pence reacted, as distinct from the way that some others reacted, was right, that the institutions of the Republic are more important than any one individual or your side at any given time. To fast forward, I think that some of the things that Trump has already done, of course accompanied with his own distinctive rhetoric, I am, for example, a very strong supporter of the State of Israel in its current travails, not an uncritical one, but a strong one. And I think some of the things that Trump has done, for example, by appointing Elise Stefanik to the United Nations ambassadorial role, are promising signs.
I've got to ask you then about what you would make of the Department of Governmental Efficiency that has been set up and the people put in charge of it.
Well,
I mean, are you a fan of that?
By their fruit shall ye know them. So it is undoubtedly the case that Elon Musk himself, again, another figure about as controversial as Donald Trump. No one can be as controversial as Donald Trump, but he's almost there. Nevertheless, has demonstrated, both with Tesla and with SpaceX, an ability to innovate and drive efficiency that, again, if you place other judgments about his character or language to one side, is remarkable. And the task of dealing with the increasing demands on government at a time of aging populations and growing expectations is huge. And one of the reasons why Trump won in 2016, one of the reasons why he maintained his support, particularly amongst people in lower socioeconomic brackets, is that unlike previous Republican presidents and challengers, he'd been clear that certain basic entitlements would remain. So he didn't want to have the radical reform towards health and social security that was contemplated beforehand by Mitt Romney and others. He was in that respect, even though it's odd to think of Donald Trump as a centrist. He was a centrist in terms of his approach towards these questions. So if you've done that, then the burden of finding expenditure savings overall and making government more efficient is all the greater. One thing that interests me is the appointment of Vivek Ramaswamy alongside Elon Musk, and I don't have an answer to that because Ramaswamy is someone who is a talented writer and polemicist, but I don't know that he has, well, he has a business background. I don't know that he has quite the sort of potential that Musk has to transform the way that things operate based on his business experience.
Okay, I mean, I want to go back briefly and touch on the extracurricular point, because, I mean, it strikes me that it's wholly infeasible to lay those sorts of things aside, whether it's, you know, the fact that the next president of the United States is a convicted felon, his attitude towards women, the fact that you have two people so close to the centre of government now who've got massive commercial interests that can be helped quite easily by a new president, which I think is going to increase cynicism about corruption and politics. I mean, aren't those things issues of concern for you, just in terms of how people view politics and the degree to which people think that politics is crooked?
Absolutely, but there are two things I would say. The first thing is, without wanting to run through the personal lives of every American president, whether it's LBJ or Bill Clinton or FDR or indeed Woodrow Wilson, there are people who've occupied the White House and done significant and worthwhile things, whose personal morals and ethics, or indeed some of whose business relationships, you can look back on and certainly find reasons to be critical of. I think that it's important to try to judge politicians in terms of their impact on all our lives, for good or ill, and at the same time to make a personal judgment. We can make a personal judgment about whether or not this is someone we would actively want to have a beer with, trust with our car late at night, or trust with other personal responsibilities. You're also right that there is always the potential for people who are in a position where they're exercising power to think about their business interests, of course. And so therefore one has to be on one's guard. But at this stage, it would be a question of ethical questions having to be dealt with, rather than ethical questions that are already matters where someone's ability to do the job after this mandate can so far be criticised.
And do you think Trump will be good or bad for Britain?
Net good. So I think that there will be particular challenges that the government faces. So I think there are three areas in particular that will be difficult for this government at this time. So the first is trade. I suspect that Trump will offer, if not a free trade agreement, certainly a more favourable trading and economic investment arrangements for the UK than for the EU. And that will force a difficult choice for the Labour government. The Labour government has, from its own point of view, quite shrewdly avoided reopening any of the Brexit debates. They know that their electoral coalition is based to a significant extent. Morgan McSweeney in particular knows this, on people who voted for Boris in 2019 and Brexit in 2016 and voted for Keir Starmer in 2024. You know, if they don't opt for, and there may be good reasons for them not to, a closer economic arrangement with America than the EU is offered, then there will be some in the Labour Party, undoubtedly, people like Stella Creasy and so on, who will quite legitimately say from their point of view, well, we need to move closer into the EU's orbit. If not fully joining the single market, then certainly having a greater degree of alignment. And as I say, that has the potential to create ructions within the electoral coalition and also to unsettle Labour MPs. It's striking that the overwhelming majority of seats where Reform are second now, are seats held by Labour MPs. There are two other areas which I mentioned briefly. One is defence. So Trump's expectation will be that the UK will increase defence spending. That will be, Labour, of course, are on a trajectory to increase it to 2.5, but I imagine the rate at which Trump will want that increase to occur will be faster than the current finances could bear. And then the final area is China. And I think the government have indicated that while they don't want to go back to the golden age of David Cameron and George Osborne of Sino-British relations, they do certainly want to have a more pragmatic approach in order to secure investment, particularly when it comes to what is no longer called levelling up, but also in the energy area. And in those three areas, there will be real difficulties for the Labour government. But I also think that there are opportunities for the UK overall, because Trump he's transactional, he's unpredictable, but he is also an Anglophile, and he's emotionally invested in the idea that whoever happens to be leading Britain, that Brexit can be seen to confer advantages.
Does it not concern you that one of the people whispering in his ear is Nigel Farage?
Well, I think Nigel Farage obviously has a closer relationship with Donald Trump than any other elected member of the House of Commons, but not necessarily any other British politician, so or British figure. There are other people who from the UK who will have an influence on, not many, but some, who will have an influence on Trump's thinking. But more than that, I think it will be the case that the Trump administration, the Trump team, will have a sense that whatever the personal and emotional proximity of Nigel Farage to Trump world, that they're dealing with the government, and they, you know, the conclusions of that might be beneficial or painful for the United Kingdom, and it may well be that Nigel Farage sees an opportunity for some political advantage for him and for reform in mixing things up. But the focus, I think, of the Trump team will be pragmatically on Britain as one of the biggest investors in the US, the UK being one of the biggest areas of investment for the US, and the defense and security and intelligence links, which are, again, familiar to everyone in this audience.
I mean, obviously, one individual who knows Trump quite well is Boris Johnson.
Yes.
There have been a lot of people willing to compare the two and to portray Johnson as some kind of British Trump. Is that fair, would you say?
I don't think so, no. I mean, I think that the fact that there are obvious superficial similarities, both because the Brexit vote occurred just before the Trump's first presidential victory, and because there's both because there are certain physical resemblances which it's easy for caricaturists to draw on, and also because they've got a similarly, what's the word, rococo approach towards extracurricular questions, and because they also have a means of communicating, which for some people can be funny, for other people can be grating to the point of nausea, you know, depending on your point of view. The similarities are drawn, but Boris at bottom is a more conventional conservative than Trump, and there are certain areas, for example, where they would take different views. So most notably on Ukraine and on trade. So Boris is obviously the European political figure, obviously no longer in office, but the European political figure at the time he was in office who was most outside Poland and the Baltics, determined to support Ukraine, and also he's an instinctive free trader. Trump's views on Ukraine are obviously different, and I think, you know, the respectrum of the views of the people around him. So Marco Rubio would take a different view on Ukraine from J.D. Vance, but it's also the case that on trade, it is undoubtedly the case that the one consistent thing, or one of the consistent things you can see throughout Trump's career, even predating his involvement in electoral politics, was his belief that America was losing out as a result of free trade, losing out first of all to Japan in the 70s and early 80s, and latterly to China, and indeed to the EU.
Actually, it strikes me that immigration is another area where they would have had very different views.
Yes, I think that's probably true. In fact, I think that's definitely true. So obviously, immigration rose when Boris was Prime Minister, and he made the point that one of the reasons why that happened was at a time of inflationary pressures. It was a way of keeping the pressures on wages and prices down, and Trump, by definition, believes that you can't have a country without borders, and that applies in the economic realm and also in the terms of migration as well. Absolutely.
Okay, so let's turn to politics closer to home. You didn't stand in. I've got to ask you this. This is the sort of question I really like the answer to. Is what did you do on election night as you weren't standing? For
Oh, right. I watched the coverage at home. So I went to a party that with some, I was going to say other journalists. was on the verge of becoming a journalist at that time, rather than being a full journalist, saw the result. I had exactly the same reaction, though I didn't know it at the time, as George Osborne subsequently confessed to, which is that when it flashed up that the Conservatives were going to get over 120 seats, I thought, oh, good. And then I realised that that was, in fact, a humiliation, and that it was because some of the polling beforehand had suggested that we might even be in third place behind the Lib Dems, that it seemed like a relief. But it's a relief because it's there was a near-death experience for the Conservative Party, but we still took a tremendous pummeling, and we were effectively, in the immediate aftermath of the election, in intensive care. So I saw that result, knew which way the wind was blowing, and then went home, watched the coverage until about, on my own actually, until about 1 o'clock in the morning, and then went to bed.
Oh, interesting. If you talk about weird responses to, I remember being at the New Statesman Party for the 2017 election, and the exit poll was published, and everyone started to cheer. And then it was almost as if everyone remembered who the Labour leader was.
Yes.
And the sort of cheer turned into a sort of strangle. They didn't know what they thought.
No.
So Labour had done well, but it wasn't their Labour, and they couldn't quite figure out. So it was a very strange few years in politics.
I did spend the compound, you know, what's the word? The impression that I'm giving of my inner nerd. I did spend the Saturday morning looking at the results in every constituency as laid out in the Times. Not a jolly way to spend your Saturday morning. And I was, as I think probably many people were, just stunned at some of the individual results. There were seats that I had, obviously there were headline losses on the night, you know, like Liz's or Gillian Keegan's and others. But I was just really taken aback by the extent to which both Labour and Liberal Democrats had won seats that I would, again, never have expected.
But at least it presumably convinced you you'd made the right decision not to stand.
Well, I felt a twinge of guilt as well about, I mean, I tried to play part in the election campaign. I felt a twinge of guilt, but I also, the reason for not standing, the principal reason for not standing, was a sense on my part that you have a limited political shelf life, that I'd come more or less to the end of mine, and that the future of the Conservative Party, wherever it lay, was going to be in the next generation.
Can I just say, for those watching online and for those of you here who are on the Slido, if you can vote for the questions you want me to put to Michael, because there are so many that I'm not going to be able to read them, and the ones you vote for will go to the top of the list and just make life easier. So what was it, what surprised you most about the election? I mean, you weren't surprised that the Tories lost. You were a little bit relieved that they didn't lose by more. But what overall, looking at those results, surprised you most?
Well, one of the things was just the success of the Liberal Democrats. So in every seat that they had targeted, they won, save for one, Jeremy Hunt's. And it was striking that there were seats with significantly bigger majorities than my own, like North East Hampshire, where the Liberal Democrats won. The other thing was just the success of Labour everywhere. And so, again, the Morgan McSweeney judgment, which was we should seek to draw the tent as widely as possible, was amply vindicated in electoral terms. And I'm not claiming any great sort of insight for myself, but I thought that Labour would beat the SNP in Scotland. The SNP did slightly worse than I anticipated or would have bet. I didn't bet on the election result in any way, to reassure you. I thought that Labour might well win in one of the seats adjacent to my old seat. I thought they might win in Aldershot, because they'd done very well in the local elections beforehand. But I was surprised that they won in Bury St Edmunds and in Suffolk Coastal, and of course in South West Norfolk.
I mean, I think one of the most amazing facts from the election for me was I think 46% of the entire Lib Dem vote they got in the constituencies they won.
Yes.
Which is just an amazingly efficient sort of voter
Yes, and I think that one of the reasons why I thought Aldershot might go Labour is because overall the biggest story of the election was that it was an ejection election. It was get the Tories out and vote for whoever was best placed to achieve that in almost every seat. A seat like Aldershot has changed over time. Obviously, it's still the home of the British Army, but as a result of a variety of trends, price of housing in London, COVID and so on, more of what we would have thought of as the home counties has families, young families, professional people who would have been living in London 10, 15 years ago. And so that's changed. I saw it in my own constituency. But the major beneficiary of that has been the Liberal Democrats, so that places like St Albans and obviously Richmond, Kingston, but now my own constituency and Guildford have become Liberal Democrat fortresses.
It's interesting. And what have you made so far of the Labour government?
Well, I was going to say that there was only one thing that I think has been good so far, but now there are now two. So the first thing is that after a slow start, I felt that the response to the riots was assured and effective, because I think it is absolutely vital that for all of the reasons that you show in response to that sort of activity, that you can deploy the police effectively, that you can get the courts operating, that there will be appropriate sentences for people who are behaving appallingly. The second thing is everything that I've heard today from Wes Streeting about NHS reform. And while I think that there are other things that are component parts of what a successful reform or improvement of the NHS might involve, I think everything he said today to me is very welcome. In other areas, I have to confess I'm a bit disappointed because, I mean, not that they're trying to please me, I'm not the target audience for this government, but in crude terms, and I hope I'm not caricaturing, the argument before the election put directly to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves was, how are you going to fund extra improvements in public services? And they said, we're going to go for growth. Planning will be part of it, but we're going to do other things as well. Okay, fine. But in office so far, their revealed preference has been to increase funding for public services and say that that is the means of then subsequently achieving growth. So they've reversed the equation, as it were. Now, of course, there's a perfectly respectable argument to be made that unless you have a healthy population, you won't maximize workforce participation, GDP, and all the rest of it. But I haven't seen anything, not even the planning changes, which really suggest that Labour are serious about turbocharging growth. And the OBR's conclusions sort of reinforce that as well. And even in an area like planning, for which I was responsible, I do think that some of the changes that Labour have made will mean that over the course of this Parliament, they should build more homes than we managed to build. They should, but they could be doing so much more because they'd made the argument, they had the mandate, but they seem to be shying away from some of the changes required.
Though one hears that actually a lot of the growth stuff will be in the Mansion House speech and in announcements made next. So they haven't actually...
No. And again, so if you'd asked me 72 hours ago about Labour's approach to the NHS, I would have said, so far all we've had is barrels of money going into an unreformed service, and that will not lead to productivity improvements. Indeed, some of that money may well be creamed off by the private sector, not to the advantage of the NHS. Now, as I say, it's not everything, but I would say Wes Streeting has demonstrated a direction of travel that is encouraging. It may well be that I will eat my words or wind my neck back in if, at the time of the Mansion House speech or more broadly, a greater level of ambition and detail is shown.
How can Wes Streeting fix the NHS and particularly fix the productivity problem that has afflicted it during and post-COVID without dealing with social care?
Well, you can't fundamentally deal with the problem unless you deal effectively with social care. I mean, there are at least two aspects to social care. One is the inequitable way in which costs fall on particular individuals and families. The other is the efficiency with which the system is run. One of the biggest problems is the interface between people leaving the hospital care and going back into the community, and part of resolving that is quite a set of detailed work about the assessments that are made and the people who are working there, but that can be done. More broadly, you just need to look at the incentives within the NHS for better performance, and the incentives are not properly aligned at the moment. One of the things is that there are three audiences, as it were, or three things that you're worried about when it comes to the NHS: the staff, the taxpayers, and the patients. Obviously, they overlap. And again, until today, Labour's revealed preference had been to support the staff and then ask the taxpayer to do it, and then the patients hadn't been in the forefront of their mind. Today, there's been a recalibration with the importance of patient care and softly approach towards the staff being recalibrated.
Now, I mean, one of the things that Labour have done consistently during the election campaign and subsequently is to point at public services that aren't working and basically say, this is because of chronic underinvestment by the Tories in power for 14 years. Do you think that's a fair criticism? I mean, looking back, and we've got the gift of hindsight now that we had a pandemic and we had we had the economic impacts of that. Was austerity a very, very expensive mistake for the country?
No, I don't think so. I think it is the case that there are real problems in our public services that will require a change, and part of that change is appropriate funding. However, Alistair Darling was arguing for austerity, which was actually, in some respects, if he'd been taken at his word, slightly tougher in the first couple of years than that which was eventually implemented by the coalition, that restoring health to the public finances was a necessary precondition for the market confidence, the stability, the economic growth that marked the coalition years. I think you can look at where the burden fell, and you can say that perhaps local government in particular bore a heavier part of the price. But ultimately,
and poorer local governments in particular.
Yes, exactly. But ultimately, you'd have to look at counterfactuals or examples elsewhere, and everyone in the wake of 2008 had choices to make. And actually, the truth of the coalition years is that meeting the ambitions that George set out actually involved delaying and delaying and delaying. So actually, austerity was softer than it might otherwise have been. Wouldn't have felt like that to people who were losing out, but compared to what the initial plans were, it was certainly softened or elongated. But then to go back, you can get public service and public sector improvement without significant increases in funding. I believe that we managed that in schools. There's another thing as well, though, which is for significant parts of the public sector, there was significant investment, capital investment in the 60s and early 70s. So many of the hospitals, many of the schools, and much of the social housing that was built then has come to the end of its natural construction life. So it's a boring but critical thing that you have hospitals that need to be rebuilt, and in particular, housing, social housing, which is actively dangerous for some of the people living in it because of the way in which it was constructed and the age of it. So whatever else one had done, whichever government had been in, then you would want to see over the course of the next 10 years a programme of capital investment in housing, in social housing, but also in other parts of the public realm.
Do you think it's fair to characterise the 2016 Brexit vote as in some way, at least, a protest against austerity? That was the sort of public verdict on...
I think it was more of a protest against globalisation than austerity per se. I think that the experience of globalisation in most developed countries, and particularly in the UK, has been greater inequality, particularly greater wealth inequality. And you had a sense in which some parts of the United Kingdom felt that they were being economically left behind and neglected, and compounded, that feeling was compounded by the sense that there was cultural condescension towards those communities.
I mean,
so
some parts were being left behind and neglected, weren't they? It wasn't just a feeling.
No, absolutely. So I think it was a mixture of geographical economic inequality and a sense of being not just economically, but culturally overlooked and undervalued.
Okay, we'll come back to Brexit in a bit more detail later on, but I want to talk about the Tory party a little bit. I think it's true to say that you endorsed Kemi Badenoch in 2022.
Yes.
Why did you do so, and do you think she will be a good leader of the Conservative Party?
I do think she will be a good leader of the Conservative Party. The reason I did so at the time was she had been a junior minister in the department that I was, at that point, Secretary of State for. And I've been very impressed by the way in which she took one of the most dry and complex areas of policy, which is local government finance. I'd said, I want to do this. And it was a sort of broad brush levelling up idea. And she went away, looked at it, and then a few days later came back and pointed out to me in great detail and with precision why it wouldn't work and why it would backfire politically and why it wouldn't even achieve the political aims that I set. So there's a phrase that she's used often about being an engineer and a systems thinker. She applied that, and she pointed out how the interlocking complexities of local government finance were not susceptible to my romantic vision, and why, if we went ahead, there would be difficulties in the system, it would require more money, and conservative areas would be in revolt. But even if I wanted to do all of that, I still wouldn't have achieved, through the approach that I was taking, the move toward, essentially the move towards the north that I wanted to see, because I hadn't thought it through. And it's very rare that you have a junior minister who's prepared not just to do the work, come back and put a proposition, but say to you, both privately and in front of the officials, you're wrong, and win the argument. And I had to acknowledge I was wrong. So I was impressed by that. I was also impressed by the way in which she handled the questions which she's more publicly known for, the questions around the response to the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities that was set up originally under Theresa May. She was depicted, has been depicted as a culture warrior. Actually, the response to that, while it is robust and one that I very strongly sympathize with, was much more nuanced, the detailed policy response, than a lot of people gave her credit for. And the way in which she navigated through Whitehall and made the case had also impressed me. So all of this was before she was in the cabinet. And I thought at the time that she had the potential to be a transformational leader of the kind that doesn't come along very often. And this probably won't help her. The two people who she reminded me of in very different ways, and she's not really like either of them, but she reminded me of them, were David Cameron and Ruth Davidson.
Okay. I mean, you said you're not a betting man, but hypothetically, if you were, would you bet on her leading the Conservatives into the next election?
Yes, definitely.
And have you been impressed by her appointment to her shadow cabinet?
Yes, I think it's difficult because you've got 121 Conservative MPs. There are a number of people who, for entirely understandable personal reasons, have ruled themselves out. So if, James Cleverly and Jeremy Hunt and Oliver Dowden and, of course, Rishi himself, for reasons I, more than anyone, can completely understand, feel that they don't want to be in the shadow cabinet at the moment, then I think you, first of all, acknowledge that anyone who ran for leader and who wants to be in the shadow cabinet has a right to be. And then secondly, you seek to make sure that you've got people who have an enthusiasm for certain areas in those roles.
The Conservative Party has changed an awful lot, hasn't it, since you first came into Parliament? And I remember, way back when, those with a certain vintage will remember people talking about the Notting Hill set.
Oh, yeah.
Does that exist anymore? Is that party gone?
I think it's changed. And I think the Conservative Party always changes, political parties always change. So, people use the phrase Blairite, but its meaning has changed over time. So, and I'll refer to Tory modernisation and the Notting Hill set in a second by analogy. So, Blairism was a specific response to a particular set of challenges that the Labour Party and the country faced at that time, whether or not you agree or disagree with it. There are people who were around then and who still have lots to contribute, Alan Milburn, Peter Mandelson, who are Blairites because they were in the Blair administration. But Tony Blair himself, in his most recent book, Leadership, takes a different view on a variety of questions than that which he had even when he was Prime Minister in his later phase. He's evolved. Some people might say he's regressed, but he's certainly changed a bit. Similarly, I think that modernisation of the Conservative Party, with which the Notting Hill set, David Cameron, George Osborne, Danny Finkelstein, myself too, up to a point, Steve Hilton, that process with which we were associated was getting the Conservative Party to adjust to a changing world. So a case in point would be a traditional Conservative Party view would be if not the silver bullet, then certainly one of the most important things that you can do to improve education in this country is to bring back grammar schools and have academic selection. And one of the big rows in modernisation was David and David Willett saying, no, that is not the way that we are going to go. And if people want to ask me about why I think that was the right decision, I'm very happy to do so. But that was part of the change. But as society changes, so a political party that is relevant to and understands the electorate changes as well. So I think another phase of Conservative modernisation happened with Brexit and indeed with Theresa May's premiership and with significant elements of Boris Johnson's premiership, which was to recognise, following on from the point that you made about Brexit, that the class composition of the Conservative Party had changed, that this was a good thing, that one of the things that had both held the Conservative Party back and actually been bad for the country was the fact that there were people with small c Conservative attitudes in the North, Midlands and elsewhere who did not vote for the Conservative Party because a mixture of class geography and history had erected a barrier. That changed the Conservative Party by the adoption of policies on levelling up and a shift of emphasis in one or two other areas, recognised that. Obviously that coalition won in 2019 and then was fractured, more than fractured, broken, in the run-up to 2024. But I personally think that it is a good thing that a political party has a cross-class basis, because a political party, certainly a governing political party of the centre-right, should be a party for working people in Blythe as much as it is a party for academics, if there are any who are still voting Conservative in Belgrade.
Sure, there are a couple. I mean, but isn't the problem with that specifically the fact that if you have a cross-class coalition, it's virtually impossible to define an economic policy that will hold that coalition together because they have conflicting interests. And didn't we see that? I mean, it was almost the worst circumstances for that sort of coalition, wasn't it? You have pandemic, you have real economic issues, you have a massive cost of living crisis, and confronted with difficult economic choices, it became impossible to hold that thing together, didn't it?
I think that the particular things that created all the problems were, you're absolutely right, the pandemic. And one of the things about the pandemic is that it had a differential impact. One of the points that was made at the time is the definition of a working class person is someone who cannot work from home. And it was undoubtedly the case that if you were insulated by the nature of your job and having a larger and more comfortable home, then the pandemic, however painful it was for everyone, was just easier to get through. And there were other challenges as well that the pandemic exacerbated, not least educational achievement. And then one of the things about Partygate, not strictly economic, but what it did is it reinforced the impression of one rule for a gilded elite who could party in the centre of London, and then another rule applying to everyone else who were facing all sorts of curtailments on liberty and painful restrictions on their lives. So it gave the impression, you know, of exactly. And then after that, there was Liz's mini budget. And again, I think that in her heart, Liz was sincere in her desire to generate economic growth, which she believed would help everyone. But for me, the decision, particularly on the top rate of tax, was a mistake, both economically and politically, and it reinforced that sense of a fracturing. So it was the case that by both because of outside actions, and both because of our own responses, whether maladroit or ideologically self-indulgent, that we did do damage to that coalition. But it is not necessarily the case that that should be so, because the original aim of levelling up was to make the point that the country can only succeed economically if we overcome the deep regional inequalities that we have, that to have London and the South East so much more productive than most of the rest of the country is serving everyone poorly. And also, if you look at some of the discontents that people have in the South East, for example, about house building, then it is much easier to bear if you've got economic growth outside London, which is accompanied by a more equal spread of housing development there. So a centre-right party can make that point, and also I think a centre-right party can say the level of expenditure, the level of taxation and the level of expenditure might be slightly greater than you might normally associate with us on the centre-right, but we're putting that money into genuinely growth-generating investment, into infrastructure, into education, and not into transfer payments that keep people on the welfare rolls or pay for the costs of social failure.
And of course, you produced that very detailed white paper on levelling up with that weird section about the Medicis that I didn't quite understand. But is there any prospect at all that Labour will follow up on some of those initiatives, do you think? I mean, I know they've got rid of the term levelling up, but... Well,
I think one thing that I think they will and are doing is that one significant component of levelling up, which is strengthening devolution to metro mayors, they're committed to, not least because most of the country is moved to Labour. But I do think that is sincere. So there are one or two questions. But overall, I don't get the same sense that there is a theory of change about addressing regional economic inequality that Labour have. You know, I think they've got a theory of change about the NHS, and a broader theory of change about how the political economy should work and who should bear the burden in terms of taxation. But I think the jury has to be out on whether or not this is something that they are taking sufficiently seriously.
Now, one of the remarkable sort of striking things about the Trump victory was that he got a significant share of the vote among young people.
Yes.
That is something that Conservatives are simply unable to do. Why is that, and how can that be addressed, do you think?
Well, I think one thing is that, as a number of people have pointed out, we're living through a time when it's very difficult for incumbents. So if you're the insurgent party, you benefit, and you benefit from the sense of discontent that young people everywhere have because of the difficulty of getting on the property ladder, and because of the fact that taxation everywhere is higher than one might want it to be because of the cost of entitlements and healthcare for an ageing population. But an interesting thing is that the natural assumption is that the culture, however defined, amongst young people is always on the left. There's a very striking piece by James Marriott in the Times this week, making the point that actually there is a lively, in some cases almost too lively in its expression, online culture, which is, if not right, contra-left, and that the Trump campaign, and again, people might think that it was either meretricious or wicked, but the Trump campaign had an ability to tap into that, which is of interest. But I think that the biggest thing is we were punished by everyone, but one of the reasons why we were punished by young people is that we made it, for young people, as they looked at whether or not they would be able to own a house, whether or not they would be able to pay off student debt at the rate they might want in order to become debt-free, and also, what the broader opportunities for them were, we weren't delivering.
Okay, but I mean, actually, just thinking back to the election, one of the striking features about it was it just felt like a vote against rather than a vote for. And you saw Labour incumbents losing vote share. Yes. You saw Labour in Wales not doing very well where they were in government. Are you concerned by both a sense of political apathy and perhaps more perniciously what seems to be a breakdown of trust on the part of the public in politics?
Yeah, I don't think people are apathetic. I think they're angry. And they were angry with us. I think the danger for Labour, and indeed for any government at the moment, is the gap between the expectations that you have to generate or are generated on your behalf as you seek to win an election, and the capacity to deliver that gap may be too great. It does create problems for democracy, and this takes us back to one of the things that it was in my mind about Trump. This term may turn out to be the terrible 4 years that all his critics have predicted. But it may also be the case that there are some changes to the way in which government operates, the services are delivered, that force us all to think again about how the state works and how it can be made more effective. And one of the challenges that we have at the moment, which has been very well put by a Labour MP, Josh Simons, who led Labour Together, he's the MP for Makerfield, is people want to have insurgent governments. And one of the points that Josh Simons has made, which I think is right, is that overall the impression is created that when people are in power, they say, we can't do this because a court tells us that we can't, or a foreign court, or our own lawyers. Or we can't do this because the OBR, or the bond markets, or the Whitehall machine. Now, each of those institutions has a point and a relevance. But the accumulated effect, in the same way as every piece of environmental regulation has a point and relevance, but the cumulative effect is that you elect someone to take a sword to the Gordian knot, and in government, they're like Gulliver tied down by the Lilliputians saying, look, I can't do anything about it. The Lilliputians have a right to this, they've got a right to do that. And Josh's point was that for Labour to succeed, they need, curiously enough, to be seen to be standing up for their voters against different blobs. And in a way, I think, the only person I can see doing that at the moment, sorry to go back, sorry to ruin his career further, is Wes Streeting, because he appears to be prepared to take on elements of the NHS blob, ugly word, but you know what I mean, in a way that others aren't. But I'm sure if we had a Labour figure here, they might contest some of that analysis. But as I say, I think Josh's analysis is spot on.
But isn't the heart of the problem that simply these, the issues we confront are big, they're complicated, they're long-term. It's going to take, with the best will in the world and the most competent government in the world, it's going to take a while for improvements to become apparent. And part of it's just about learning. Part of it is about toning down expectations, isn't it? Which, my God, this government's are good at. And making people realise that these things can't be fixed overnight. And in a sense, looking back to the Johnson government, it always struck me that one of the problems was there was a three-word solution, probably a three-word slogan, possibly a world-beating in there. And no recognition of the fact that doing this is hard.
Well, I think I agree with the first part of that, but I think there was a recognition amongst lots of people of how hard it might be. But I think that sometimes, in a desire to enthuse, the complexity of issues was occluded. But I think that one of the real things that Boris understood instinctively is that people need to see you fighting. So, just touching on Brexit. When Boris removed the whip from 21 of my colleagues, I was incredibly wet, queasy, and unsettled because they included friends of mine. So, the idea that friends like Ed Vaizey and Greg Clark were no longer Conservative MPs, I thought, So I had squeamishness. But from a political point of view, Boris had to do everything to demonstrate to the country and to the eventually election-winning 2019 coalition that he was going to, three-word phrase, get Brexit done. And so to move it away, because again, there are lots of people in the audience who might think that that is a grotesque analogy and all the rest of it, but still, if it is the case that voters can see that you are striving hard to overcome opposition, it's not just the case that you are spending more money, you are also getting to grips with the problem. And by definition, if a public service is not delivering effectively, there will be some people in it who will be happy with the status quo and not happy with change. If people are aware that those people are concerned, then they'll know, or should know, that you are on their side. You are on the side of the voter whose tax is being spent, the patient waiting on a waiting list, rather than regarding the RCN and the BMA as the most important voices in this debate.
So it makes political sense to break the law then? I mean, if you think about prorogation around the same time.
I don't know about, I would argue, I won't go back over that, but I think the whole point is that, in terms of the whole law-breaking question, but I think that sometimes you have to be seen to be striving might and main to achieve a goal that you've been asked to do. And again, in a way, there is a respectable high Tory argument, which is be careful of majorities, be careful of referenda, be careful of the mood of the people. That is volatile. It is more important to safeguard institutions because the democratic wind may blow in a particular direction, but if you allow the institutions to buckle, you don't know when it blows back in a way that you don't like, where your protection will be. I absolutely understand and have a lot of sympathy with that argument. However, I think we're in a world now where as I say, people aren't apathetic, they're angry, they expect results, and the balance in many Western democracies is one where those institutional restrictions appear to bind the person who should be there acting on behalf of the electorate, and people feel frustrated that their champion is allowing themselves to be restricted and then making excuses for their inability to deliver.
Yeah, but the danger, surely, though, is that you're essentially rolling the pitch for the populists. Well, by weakening those institutional constraints.
Well, I think again, I think one of the things has been the extent to which people have sometimes said, populists are raising this concern, therefore the institutions that they're attacking we must defend, rather than saying, A, is this actually potentially a legitimate concern, and one that we haven't addressed in our complacency? And secondly, are we saying that we will defend this institution come what may, or does it require itself to be reformed and changed? And we're seeing that happen in Europe at the moment. So people who would have thought of themselves as mainstream figures, mainstream centre-right figures, are chafing at the restrictions that they face from courts in particular on questions of migration. And so Michel Barnier, in his initial presidential run, or early presidential run when he was trying to get the Gaullist nomination, argued that there should be a referendum in France to free France from some of these constraints. So, if it is the case that you look at everything that appears to march under the banner of populism as anathema, what you end up doing is reinforcing the strength of those whom you wish to oppose. And that, in a way, is one of the things that happened in the US presidential election. So some people might have thought that the way in which Trump used transgender questions in his political communications was at best unseemly, at worst worse. But nevertheless, there was real concern, and the Democrats' position on it was one that a majority of people in the country did not share. And there's been some, I think, very good opinion writing from Democrats like, and I'll get his name along, Rt who wrote, who's been a sort of, way back to the days of Clinton, a sort of new Democrat, centrist Democrat, making the point that many of the impulses that voters had that led them to vote for Trump were impulses that the Democrats should recognize, not by endorsing Trump's rhetoric or policies, but by having a a stronger line on the protection of young people, a stronger line on what was happening in campus and so on.
Okay. I'm going to come to you lot for a minute, and there should be a mic coming around. We've got some time for questions from the audience. But before we do, I want to touch on Brexit, because it would be a shame not to. Do you still think it was right for us to vote to leave the European Union in 2016? Do you think that was the right decision?
No, more than ever.
Why?
Because it partly related to the way, what we've just been discussing, the way the world is changing. If one wants, broadly, liberal democratic or Christian democratic in a European sense, centre-right, traditional conservative positions, to survive and adapt, then we need to have a stronger feedback loop, a more effective feedback loop between governed and government. And the European Union was in a position and has subsequently moved to be even more in a position where the phenomenon that I've been describing of the leader who willingly finds their discretion and their room for initiative fettered becomes a leader who rapidly loses legitimacy. And I think that the trend within the European Union is of increasing exasperation and people moving in different directions politically to express that. I think that it is perfectly possible we'll be able to demonstrate that we will, in the next few years, I'm sure even the Labour government will, take decisions on everything from AI to the gene editing of plants, which will put us in a stronger economic position. But even if we chose not to, the fundamental fact that you are recognizing the power and the importance of democracy, I think is the single most important thing. And one of the things that reassures me is that case was made with force at the time by people on the left, like Richard Tuck, and they haven't resolved from it. And indeed, there are other people on the left who weren't making the case at the time, and I don't know how they voted, but people like Helen Thompson, who I think if one were to ask her, I don't want to put words in her mouth, would say that for democracy to work, people have to show how Brexit is going to work, that it was a wake-up call letter from the overlooked that you don't respond to by showing them a series of charts suggesting...
Staircase.
Yes.
But would you accept that that political independence is going to come at an economic price?
Not necessarily, no.
Or that it has to date? I mean, our goods trade has been significantly affected, hasn't it?
Yes, but I think that the first thing is, if one looks at the economic consequences of a nation seceding from a free trade area or an empire at any given point, there are always initial frictions. We don't know how long they will last for, we don't know how big they will be, but an analogy I used at the time, when in 1776 the American colonists chose to leave the then British Empire, there was an economic cost. And indeed, there was sort of 20 years of internal political upheaval. It wasn't clear, if you were just looking at both the economic statistics and also, political peace, that it was definitely going to work until 1812 or 1820. Now no one would put the clock back. Similarly, it was undoubtedly the case that when the 26 counties seceded to form the Irish Free State, there was an economic cost for Ireland. Nobody now would suggest that you should go into a forthcoming Irish general election saying, let's reconstitute the old United Kingdom. So, to me, I place a higher price on democratic control and the fruits that I believe that it brings than most things. But I also believe that the economic costs will diminish over time. Mervyn King made the point that if you were to look in 20 or 30 or 50 years' time at Britain's economic performance, you wouldn't be able to point at a moment in time and say, that was the moment when we left the EU, because there is a dramatic dip. It's the decisions that are taken by governments in other areas that will matter, or will be taken by our government, for good or ill, that will matter far more.
But I mean, despite all that, it is still potentially the case that because of the impact on trade, there is going to be that negative short-term, medium-term maybe. I mean, none of the economists have changed their forecasts, have they?
No, there has been an impact on trade, and there's been an impact on particular sectors of the economy, but there is also, I remember this point being made by Nigel Lawson. In all the time that Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, obviously she signed up to the Single European Act, but that only came into effect in 1992. In all the time that Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, there was no new trade liberalisation within the UK. What there was regulatory change that generated, and lots of other changes as well, supply side changes, that generated an increase in the trend rate of economic growth. So it's one amongst many factors, but not the only one. And as I say, Nigel Lawson's view was that the trade regulation arbitrage, i.e. you may certainly lose in trade, but you will gain in regulatory freedom, meant that it was economically rational to go for regulatory freedom.
Okay. And do you think Brexit has been done right to date? I mean, are there things we ought to have done differently or done better? There was that big running argument in the Conservative Party about retained EU law.
Yes. Well, nothing is ever done perfectly, and there are all sorts of things, but, some of them related to the 2017 election result, which created all sorts of difficulties. And I mean, I think it comes back to a point about Kemi. I think that she was right on retained EU law to say what you need to do is ambitiously work to change rather than simply clear house and then build back up, because that creates legal uncertainty in all sorts of areas. But I think one of the things I've said to Labour friends, I do have some, is that, of course, I'm talking my own book, and I would say this, wouldn't I? But there are things that a centre-left government can do outside the European Union and should consider. Of course, one of the...
VAT on schools.
Exactly. One of the things they are doing is precisely that.
It'll be interesting to see what the European Court makes of it when it gets there. Right, I think we've got a few minutes left for any of you who've got questions. If you can keep them as short as possible, there should be a mic. I mean, I can't see a thing, so if the people with the mics want to decide who are asking the questions, that would be lovely.
Thank you both. Mr. Gove, my question is, over the past couple of decades, many in the British Muslim community have felt alienated over rhetoric and policy from both major parties, and this is reflected in the UK and a Changing Europe's Minorities Report, where a lot of the Muslims have abandoned both major parties. So I just wanted to ask what you think about this and how you think the Conservative Party specifically can address this, especially in light of the rise of Reform and other such parties.
We really like questions that reference our reports. That's excellent. Should we do them one at a time? Because then we...
Yes. Well, I think one of the great things that the UK and a Changing Europe and also organisations like Syndicate Wallace British Future do is they look in a granular way at what is going on within different communities. So we know that political, social, cultural attitudes vary not just between people from the African and from the Afro-Caribbean diaspora in the UK, but as distinct from people who come from the West African diaspora and the East African diaspora. And even there, attitudes vary depending on whether or not people's families or heritage is in Nigeria or in Ghana. The reason I make that point is that I think it is unhelpful to talk about parties' attitudes towards BAME voters overall. I think the questions that one should ask are, how successfully are we providing opportunities for integration for people from a whole variety of backgrounds? And what are the specific barriers both erected by society, but that also exist within those communities. It's striking that we have a challenge in integration and in securing better socioeconomic outcomes for people from South Asian diaspora Muslim communities, but that is not unique to the UK. That applies also in Canada as well. And I think the best way of tackling that issue is a proper analysis and a respectful dialogue between individuals. But there is another challenge as well, which is there is, within Muslim communities, there are individuals who specifically want to take discontent, and there'll be discontent for a variety of reasons, legitimate, illegitimate, take discontent and turn it into support for an ideological rejection of Western democracy. So there are organizations like Hizb ut-Tahrir and offsprings of the Muslim Brotherhood that specifically want to, for want of a better word, radicalize. And they have been imperfectly challenged, not just by others within British Muslim communities, but by the British state. And unless you can have an honest conversation both about, you know, educational underperformance, socioeconomic factors, in particular, the position that young women face, and what more government and its agencies need to do, alongside also looking at some of the motors of radicalization, unless you can have that broader conversation, then I don't think we're going to achieve all of the progress that we need to make. And just as a case in point, one of the things that we did with the Labour Mayor of Leicester, Peter Soulsby, who's brought down the left of Leicester, is that we agreed under the last government that the disturbances that had occurred in Leicester, which had been characterised as Hindu versus Muslim, required close academic study, because we needed to see to what extent everything from housing to recent migratory flows to economic inequality to the work of agitators, whether within Leicester or from outside, had contributed to that. So I think, and it may seem like a cop-out in a way, but I think closer analysis is required before confidence about what the right measures are.
You mentioned the way that the right-wing, that Trump was able to utilise the right-wing media to tap into a younger fan base. Do you think there's a similar role in Britain for media types like the Spectator in utilising those who had previously felt disenfranchised by the Conservative Party?
I think the Spectator is in a different position because you know, there are some magazines and there are some sites, platforms that are explicitly political. And obviously, I was a politician. But the thing about the Spectator, in the words of my predecessor, Fraser, is that the experience of reading the Spectator should be like going to a party, not sitting through a lecture. Now, obviously, there are some lecturers who are brilliant, and you know, you'd happily give up any party invitation to go and listen to them. But the point he was trying to make is that, you know, at a good party, or certainly a party I'd enjoy going to, you might find someone fascinating who would explain to you why Trump was better than you thought, or at least explain why he won, and you might disagree, but it'd be interesting. Then you have a conversation with someone who is funny and hilarious. Then you have a conversation with someone who tells you the book that they've most enjoyed reading, the play that they would love you to go and see. And then at the end, you have someone who whispers gossip into your ear and recommends the best restaurant to go to. And that's what the Spectator seeks to provide. But what we also, I think, need to do is to do two things, which is to understand that, yes, there's Westminster politics and people want to know about that. Will the assisted dying bill make it, or you know, what are the currents and the arguments against it? But also, you're right, there's a broader sense in which politics is taking place through cultural conversations elsewhere. And we owe it to our readers, and the sort of legacy media overall owes it to everyone to try to understand what's going on. One of the benefits, not my doing, of the previous editor and the way he ran the Spectator is there's a very young team there, and the internships to the Spectator are offered on a CV blind way. And I think, as I say, I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but I do think that for any institution, you need to have a team or new recruits who understand some of what's bubbling under and where political arguments or anger are being expressed elsewhere.
Thank you. And the mic should be...
Hi there, my name's Jake, and I just want to follow on perhaps on a slightly lighter touch than the Spectator. As we know, the current leader of the opposition is a Spectator alumni. Is there anyone currently working at the Spectator you think we should keep our eyes on?
Oh, right. So obviously, Boris Johnson, Conservative leader, editor of the Spectator. Kemi Badenoch worked for the Spectator, now leader of the Conservative Party. Yes, there are some very, very good people working at the Spectator at the moment. But I worry that if I shout out the names, that two things will happen. One, anyone who's a representative of a rival media organisation will immediately poach them. Two, that I will blight their future overall. But no, we are very lucky. I mean, well, one of the things I would say is that we have not just writing for the magazine, but also contributing to our emails and our podcasts, a very good team. I think that the politics team, Katie Bowles and James Heal, are superb. James is a very young guy. I also think that we have writers like Angus Colwell, Max Jeffrey, Laura Prendergast, Cindy Yu, Svetlana Morenz, who are really, really talented, and they cover a very broad waterfront in what they do.
If we take one last question from
Thank you. My name's Brian Weller, and I'd just like to ask, do you think Trump will help us deal with the liberal institutions around the world? And do you think that the ECHR debate has been forgotten, or will we be able to deal with that before the next election?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing is there are some, everyone's got their own, in the same way as everyone's got their own Spotify favorites, everyone's got their own list of institutions that they like and dislike, or certainly politicians do. And so I have a big downer on the UN for a host of reasons, which is why I referenced Elise Stefanik going there. I hope she managed to shake that institution up in the right way, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, with respect to its attitude towards Israel. There's a broader question, though, about the institutions that were forged in the aftermath of the Second World War, at the time of Bretton Woods, and also alongside the UN, and how they should be reformed. And ideally, what one would want to see is reform, not destruction. And there's a debate going on, I'm sure, in the circles around Trump about NATO in that regard. I don't know, I've never asked him, but on the basis of the sorts of things that he said, I believe that Trump actually wants to strengthen NATO, but his distinctive approach towards it is to make it look as though he's leaving art of the deal style in order to get others to pony up. Let us see. One could say similar things about the WTO as well, and some of the ways in which it's operated. Will those changes be beneficial to the UK? Well, I can imagine them being changes that would be definitely beneficial to the US, but not necessarily beneficial to the UK. So we've got to make our own judgments about whether or not what he's arguing for is in our interest or something that we should seek to ameliorate, resist, or work with others to stop. On the ECHR, I think that the danger is that people look at just one institution and it's related to the Trump point and say, right, let's leave. I know there's the person who, once we had the debate on the EU, said, right, let's leave. I'm probably in a poor position to counsel against further departures. But I think that the question is, to what extent, when it comes either to dealing with migration or dealing with other questions, is it possible to anticipate operating effectively within the current framework? But the other thing also is that the sense that I have amongst other signatory nations in Europe is that they recognise some of the problems with the ECHR, some of the problems with the CJEU, but also some of the problems with the conventions to which we subscribed in the aftermath of the Second World War for entirely the right reasons, but in an age of cheaper travel and in an age where populations are on the move, do need to be reviewed. As I say, a debate about the ECHR I don't think can take place in isolation from those other considerations.
Blimey, spot on time. It's almost like you've done this thing before. Michael, thank you so
No,
much
not
for
at all.
taking
No,
the time.
thank you.
It's
Thanks,
been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Listen. So, what time do you need to be out of here?
I was supposed to be